The psychedelic movement is part of a broader movement, which is basically ushering Western civilization away from modernity or beyond modernity with philosophical materialism. That's crumbling. The new atheist movement was kind of like the last gasp of triumphalism from that movement. And it's gone, it's evaporating. And so the psychedelic movement, along with a renewed interest in the occult and New Age, I think are symptoms. And then on a positive side, we see an openness to Christianity again that we haven't really seen 15 years ago. We're seeing it now among younger generations. I think we need to try and recover a sort of responsible and biblical Christian mysticism, because that is a legitimate part of what we see in the scriptures and church history.
Hello and welcome to What Would Jesus Tech? My name is Andrew Noble, and we are entering into the psychedelic moment. That's what the author of something called The Coming Psychedelic Moment, Phil Cotnoir. I always say your name improperly as a joke, but how do you say it in the French way? How would you properly
The French way, it would be Cotnoir, but in English circles, we would just say Cotnoir.
Okay, and we can just call you Phil.
Yeah, that works.
So Phil, as you've heard, is joining us today. He is a writer who has kind of focused in on this topic in some of his writings. He's also a father and a editor, and he writes a lot for the Gospel Coalition Canada, which is near and dear to me because I also write for that publication quite a bit. He has a blog with his name, first and last name.com, Phil's Scribblings, more of a traditional blog in that sense. You haven't moved over to Substack yet, have you?
No, I thought about it, but I've decided that I'm just going to stick with writing for TGC Canada for the most part and update my blog a little bit more as a personal thing.
Substack is not everything it is cranked up to be. It's good. It's good for a lot of things, but Substack Notes really twisted what Substack could have been.
Mm-hmm. So psychedelics are something I know very little about, both by experience and by reading, other than seeing some of the things that you've written. So I'm asking this not only on behalf of listeners, but on behalf of myself. What are psychedelics?
Okay, well, psychedelics are a category of drug or substance that happens. It occurs naturally, and many synthetic artificial compounds have been created, usually inspired by natural compounds that have various effects. When we think of psychedelic drugs, classically in Western culture, we're thinking of things like LSD, which create visual, perceptive, audio distortions depending on dose. They can also sort of send you into a mystical experience that is, beyond just affecting what you're seeing visually. It literally, you're like in a dream state where you're no longer in your current physical environment, but you're having a kind of a vision where your consciousness is somewhere else. Milder psychedelics will have milder effects, but it's this kind of transformation of human consciousness that seems to be, I think, the hallmark of psychedelic substances, and they've been around for a very long time. And so that, I think, is probably the simplest way to answer that first question.
Yeah. And so some people might be listening to this point and thinking to themselves, I thought I was following a tech podcast. And my response to them would be to say that with John Dyer, he says, technology is the means by which we transform the world as it is into the world that we desire. And I would argue that psychedelics are one of those means. It's taking things, whether naturally or the thing that gets produced, or laced with, whatever you call it. And then all of a sudden I'm changing my reality. I'm changing my experience of what is going on, and even understanding what is real to escape reality, perhaps. And yes, there is a huge technological impulse to it, but I would also argue it's just a technology in and of itself. I'd argue that medicine is a kind of technology when you understand technology more broadly. So that's why we're going into it today, and the lessons that you think about what we've learned from technology more generally can be applied to psychedelics, but there are some particular questions that we need to ask and answer. So psychedelics as a product to do something, how did you get interested in this? Like, is this your own personal experience? Do you endorse it, or is this something that you have kind of responded to for different reasons?
Yeah, good question. No, the short answer is I have no experience with psychedelics. Personally, I never got into the drug scene as a teenager or a young adult. The way I got into it, interestingly, is when a couple came to our church and found Christ, and they were coming out of a new age psychedelic sort of occult background, where psychedelics had very much been a part of their spiritual journey. And so as I was talking with them, and we were talking about the things of God, and just they were explaining this world to me, and I had lots of questions because it was it was so different than at the time, sort of the standard foil for Christianity was like new atheism, like a hard secular materialism. And so, kind of the whole posture of apologetics was like responding to the atheist arguments, responding for like why it's reasonable to believe in God or to believe in a spiritual world. And here I was talking to some people who, for whom the questions were so different. They believed in a spiritual world. They believed in an active spiritual world. They believed in all kinds of techniques and substances that could put you in touch with the spiritual world. And in the midst of that, they and others in those circles had been having these profound encounters with Christ and coming to believe in him and repent of those things. And I was just like really, really intrigued by that trajectory, which I started to see. As soon as I started digging a little bit, I started to see this trajectory over and over of people sort of in psychedelic spirituality, new age circles, eventually finding their way to Christ. And so I just found that really intriguing, and I just started researching, trying to understand it, and did some writing about it. And here we are.
One of the things that I've learned is that this really does seem to be a path. We even referenced it in our most recent episode of someone who was on psychedelics and ended up becoming Christian. There's that book called The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever.
Yeah.
Which even just the title itself, like the thing that would make everything okay forever, transcendence, psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. Do you want to talk a little bit, Phil, about that story? I know you reviewed that book, just as an example that maybe will help listeners get a sense of what's going on here.
Yeah, that's a wonderful conversion memoir by Ashley Land, published by Lexham. And she's a wonderful writer, by the way, a beautiful prose writer. And she tells a story of her own journey, and the pattern of her story matches a lot of stories in these circles, with a kind of a nominal Christian background and sort of an exploratory phase in adolescence, kind of rejecting Christ and the church for various reasons, and then exploring alternative spirituality and finding in psychedelics and kind of the new age world a real sense of enlightenment and consciousness expanding. And there's this attractiveness to that whole world where one really feels like you're getting in touch with something deeper, more meaningful. A kind of a mystery is being revealed. And I think it's part of the attraction and deception of that whole scene is these experiences are so, you know, they're convincing, they're authentic in the sense that they are legitimate experiences. And I think in the disenchanted modern West, getting in touch with that kind of transcendent experience is a powerful thing. So people are drawn to that. And so that was her case. And so, but, you know, but it's never enough. And so then the experience wears off, and the enlightenment, once you're off the drug and it's, Monday morning, it just sounds like a lame platitude, and your life is very much the same. They keep returning, and so that was Ashley's story. She kept returning, and her life unraveled in a number of ways, but it was an encounter with a Christian going through tragedy that really opened her eyes to the fact that she didn't have the kind of solidity, poise, and spiritual certainty that her friend had. Her friend lost a child, and so and just seeing how her friend handled that was kind of a wake up call to her, that for all of her spiritual enlightenment through psychedelics, she was nowhere near having the kind of, solidity in her soul that her friend clearly had. And so that got her looking at Christ a second time and reevaluating her choices. And I think that's a pretty common kind of trajectory, where people become disillusioned with the promises of psychedelic enlightenment and spirituality. It doesn't ultimately deliver the kind of enlightenment that it promises. So, yeah.
That's helpful. Joel, you've worked in tech a bunch. Would you say this is a popular thing or on the rise within tech circles?
Yeah, actually, and I think we talked about it in the last pod, but also just even on my social media feed, I saw a bunch of people going to Burning Man recently, and it's Burning Man has a very high overlap with tech of people who are looking for some sort of spiritual experience because there is that void there, and often, to give people that experience, there's, for people who don't know about Burning Man, you go into the middle of the desert, and you can only survive with what you bring with you, and you often don't bring everything for full survivors, so you barter with other people, and that leads to like, well, we rely on each other and building like these relationships, and then it kind of like can go into the occult, or it can go into psychedelics and go into like all of these people with their different motives coming together, and that being kind of an experience. And then people who leave after that, call themselves burners, and they feel part of this community. But I think there is like an even more interesting technology angle that I started to think about during this podcast in AI, and AI allowing both new synthetic drug design and having that iterate faster, as it was mentioned, like, mushrooms or psilocybin is like kind of like a naturally occurring psychedelic. And then a lot of the synthetic ones were based off of how that interacts with your brain and, causes like new neuron connections. And so the synthetics now combined with, let's say, microdosing really opens up this sort of, let's call it a gray discussion, where I think in previous conversations people talk about like, drinking alcohol, is that good or bad, caffeine, weed, and all of these kind of like, we have a baseline for like, how do we qualify if this is morally good or bad? And oftentimes it's like, does it take you away from God? Is it like really like putting you into a position where you can't hear from God because you're just so drunk or, like consumed by this drug? And when you get into a state of like microdosing, which I don't know if it's true or not, but even like ketamine, which isn't a traditional psychedelic, I believe, but also has some disembodiment feelings. Elon Musk was apparently been known to be microdosing ketamine during his work, right? So there is like this weird, like, it's not just go to a party and take psychedelics. It becomes more of a different
self-optimization.
Yeah, and that's where the
changing the
tech
human
angle.
nature almost.
Yeah, it's so now I'm very interested to hear the thoughts on, where are we going as well.
Phil?
Wow, I mean, yeah, you raise a lot of fascinating discussions there. I've thought about these issues a lot, and I wouldn't say that I have a final definitive answer, but I think what's been helpful for me is sort of separating psychedelic use into three different categories. And I've been helped by a new friend. Reverend Joe Welker, who comes out of the psychedelic movement. He and I have been talking, and so he has this threefold. I had two categories in my mind, and he helped me see that it's really more like three. So the first would be psychedelics for spiritual uses. So you're really looking for a spiritual sort of experience, connection, enlightenment, contact, that kind of thing. Second would be recreational use, where you're at a party and you're just, you're feeling reckless, you're looking to have a good time, change your state of mind and consciousness. You're just looking to go on a trip. So that's second category, would be recreational. And the third would be medical or therapeutic, and this is where there's a lot of stuff going on right now at various levels, whether it's grassroots movements, whether it's companies starting up, and there's a lot happening at the regulatory level in the States and in Canada, where the legal status of these substances is actively being revisited.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some history there, but those are the three main categories. I think they often blend together, so it's not neat and tidy in terms of why people use psychedelics. It'll often be a mix, but I think having categories helps us think through the permissibility of various applications, because as Christians we want to think biblically. And so I can just quickly sketch out sort of the clearer examples, and then we can discuss a little bit some of the more gray areas. But for in terms of spiritual use, there's a long history of pagan people, indigenous people, using psychedelics as part of their religious rituals. Even go back to the Greeks and something like the Eleusinian mysteries. There's strong evidence that there was a psychedelic component to these mystical experiences, and hearing from the gods. And so that's a very well-worn use case for psychedelics, and the scriptures really have that nailed shut in terms of its prohibition of pharmakia. The use of drugs for spiritual uses
Wait.
really falls under
Prohibition
sorcery.
of pharmakia? Is
Yeah,
that like tell me more about that briefly?
So pharmakia is the Greek word that appears in Galatians 5:20 and Revelation 18:23, often translated in English as sort of sorcery. But the Greek lexicon usage for it there's no real straight English equivalent. It really sort of wraps up together the use of drugs for spiritual purposes. So it could be manipulating others, but it has also this component of pagan rituals, religious rituals. So I think under that rubric, there's this I would say it's almost universal. Sort of people who take the Bible seriously understand that using psychedelics for spiritual uses is completely out of bounds for Christians. And then the second use, recreationally, I think is also out of bounds for similar reasons, because of the effects that psychedelics have on us, and because of the the calls that we see to remain sober minded, and just kind of what you laid out, Joel, about being in having self control over one's thoughts. Having basically a psychedelic trip is the opposite of that. But then the third case, medical therapeutic use, that's where I think there's an interesting discussion to be had. And I think it's insufficient for Christians to just say it's always and forever wrong to use psychedelics. I've heard some Christians say that they're like inherently demonic. These substances are inherently evil. It's like the devil's food. So if you touch it, there's something spiritual about the actual mushroom itself. And I think we need to resist that and think a little bit more carefully.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if you guys want to jump in there, but I'm happy to sort of expand on that a little bit. But those are the three categories that I think help to guide our thinking about psychedelic use.
It kind of brings up the opposite, like, endorsement of it, of God made it, so it must be good. But there is, within my understanding of technology criticism, one of the things I always push back against the hard technology pessimists, is that God is sovereign over history. He wants technology to be flourished. Technology has some inherent goodness by being the work of human hands is not always a negative thing. It's in fact what God wanted Adam and Eve to do. And there's an expectation there. So there must be some goodness in technology, and there must be some goodness in psychedelics. You know what I mean? Like, I really want to allow for, now, that said, the world's tainted by sin, so there's nothing that's pure goodness in any respect now, other than God himself. So I think we need to caution any quick statement of good or evil. But there is some who would say, you know, why can't I use it? Because God created it, you know, like, especially when it's naturally occurring. Like, I've heard people, a lot of times it comes up of like, get away from technology, get away from social media, and get into nature. Well, is this not nature? How can we say a sunset is good for you compared to a screen? How can we say that a trip to the woods is better for you than, you know, a time with your Xbox? Like, what is it about the natural substance of a pharmaceutical that is really so wrong, Phil?
Yeah, and I was gonna jump on top of that and say that I'm probably already kind of in that camp of like, hey, like fermentation happens naturally, you know, like you can drink, and then it's a question of like, well, how much, or like, what are the intentions, like we just previously discussed. So kind of really maybe to expand my understanding, I also would like to know like what is actually happening, if you do know, like on a scientific level, with psychedelics in your brain, and how does that kind of differ a little bit from, let's say, like what people would call the devil's lettuce, back to your analogy on like forbidden plants with marijuana.
Yeah. Well, different psychedelics affect the brain differently. So there's not really one mechanism, but they either stimulate or inhibit certain receptors and certain substances that the brain creates sort of organically. Um, and so, but there is a mystery fundamentally, even in the best research, like even going back to human consciousness. Like I've studied human consciousness and tried to understand, well, what's the state of the best science on human consciousness and the relation of that consciousness to the brain. And it is fundamentally mysterious and unsolved. And I would say the best evidence, you know, points away from a materialist understanding, a purely materialist understanding. And yet we can all acknowledge that the brain has a great effect on the consciousness. So what is happening when someone takes, let's say, dimethyltryptamine? You know, DMT is kind of, they call it the God molecule. It's kind of the strongest psychedelic in one sense. DMT is the synthetic version of the active ingredient in ayahuasca, and you'll hear a lot of celebrities and different people talking about ayahuasca. And ayahuasca is a psychedelic tea that is taken in sort of the Amazon basin, again for spiritual purposes, for personal enlightenment, and so when people take DMT, the synthesized version, you know, it's a very intense experience. They're ushered into a new reality, like almost instantly, and typically it only lasts about 15 minutes, so it's very intense, very quick, and then you're out. There are studies happening in the UK, I think associated with Oxford right now, where they've developed a way to deliver it intravenously so that the DMT experience can be extended and like for hours at a time. And so they're sending volunteers into what they call the DMT realm, and they're talking about mapping out the realm, and people have these very strange experiences where two people or three people will take DMT at the same time, not be in contact with each other, but experience the same thing or encounter the same entities. And so, you know, Christians rightly sort of have red flags raising at that point. And so it raises questions of, okay, there's something, it seems like there's something spiritual going on here. And yet it's just a chemical affecting the brain. So the materialist says, well, this is just your brain creating a reality the same way that it does when you're dreaming. And dreams are mysterious. I mean, how does the brain come up with this high resolution, incredible simulation? It is amazing. And so they have a materialist explanation. But then as soon as you kind of break that down, it becomes like, okay, these entities seem to have agency. People, I mean, there's a whole world, a dark world of entity experiences that you can go down and on in Reddit or wherever people sort of share their experiences. And you've got everything from like beautiful light beings to really demonic stuff, anyways, I'm kind of rambling off topic there, but you were asking about how this affects the brain. And I think as a Christian, I would say it seems to, um, these stronger psychedelics where you're having a fully immersive experience, it seems to be opening a kind of an aperture of one's consciousness, one's experience. And I think that there is a spiritual danger in those applications specifically because of the experience that people have reliably. It's just over and over. You hear people talk about the spiritual effects of what those of what those encounters have meant, the kinds of messages they're receiving from entities on the other side. So there's something dark there. But then when you kind of dial it down to people microdosing psilocybin or ketamine, it's like, well, now we're not really talking about the same thing. So it's a nuanced conversation that has to be kind of parsed carefully.
Yeah, I think on the comment on ayahuasca, I've seen in the tech circle, a lot of people say they got one-shotted, right? Which is to say that like they take it and then they like are completely a different person after like one, let's say 15-minute encounter, which is like, the magnitude and experience is like on another level where it really can be, mind altering, I guess, to use that phrase. And then the microdosing can be kind of smaller. And as I was kind of like recalling, like prior research I've done on kind of like how it affects the brain, I believe psychedelics affect a particular serotonin, right? Which is what differentiates themselves from, cannabinoids or like ecstasy, which affect different chemicals in the brain. And what they were saying is the serotonin, when you affect that, you're actually creating this opportunity for atypical neuron pathways to occur, right? So let's say what's actually happening is you have senses. So you can feel, you can smell, you can see. They're all tied to different sections in your brain. And now when you kind of like change the thresholding requirements for these neurons to fire, you can see color, right? You can see smells, right? That's like another like psychedelic explanation that people say when they've gone through that. And what's happening is the senses from your neurons associated with smell are now crossing over to the neurons from sight. And that's how that's actually happening in the brain. So I think on, an extreme level, we could say that, hey, if I'm going to go and read the Bible early morning and I'm taking a coffee to get my brain into an alert state, right, to adjust my senses so that I can focus, there is a line where instead of taking coffee, it's another new synthetic or naturally occurring like micro dose that allows you to do that. But then on the other hand, if you take it too much, are you connecting or allowing yourself to be more sensitive to like the spiritual realm and all of the dark stuff that's associated with it? So at least that's where my brain's going in this conversation.
Is that kind of research, going back to what Oxford is doing in terms of pushing the limits to see how far this goes? Like, is that research that we should be doing? Like, are we playing with something that, I mean, for not even the volunteer's sake, just like, are these people going to be just completely ruined for the rest of their lives because of this psychedelic experience? Like, if they're truly getting, hours worth of this stuff, and if a 15-minute dose of it can have such lasting implications. Like, is this research even ethical?
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question. Difficult question to answer. I mean, these are volunteers, but um, I think it's a good segue into sort of the state of research and some of the controversy that there has been even very recently about psychedelic research that's been going on. There's been kind of a war unfolding or playing out sort of behind the scenes where there's a small group of very well-funded activists who really have a mission to mainstream psychedelics. They are convinced from their personal experiences that it is the way to elevate their consciousness and elevate the collective consciousness of our society. They also have spiritual beliefs that are kind of wrapped up in that, where this, this opens the mind to understand that, every religion has the same mystical root, and we're getting in touch directly with the original mystical experiences that gave rise to all the different religions when one takes psychedelics responsibly. And therefore, we can do away with all of these divisive, religious disagreements. So that is definitely a well documented, and they're quite open about that. And so they've been funding research to try and leverage the authority and the medical sort of reputation of a place like Johns Hopkins University, to advance this perception that psychedelics are basically safe, and that they are sort of really going to be the next wave of treatment for our mental health crisis, which everyone agrees mental health is not doing so well generally. So, and that's part of what my piece at Mere Orthodoxy was pointing to, was this coming collision between rising mental health problems and this hyped up promise of psychedelic healing.
And Joe Rogan has talked about that too, right? Like he, with the most popular podcast on the planet, will make passing reference to how psychedelics are good for these kinds of things.
Rogan has repeatedly and at length hyped up the promise of psychedelics. I think he's toned it down a little bit, but in the last number of years, yes, that's been a major theme of his podcast. And he's had repeated guests on from this world who make very, very big claims about the promise of psychedelics. They say stuff like, one session of psychedelics is as good as 10,000 hours of psychotherapy, or that, we should have
maybe 10,000 hours
of
of psychotherapy isn't that good anyways, but
that's a separate conversation.
That's the line.
Or all our elected officials should have a psychedelic experience so that they can kind of get out of their monkey, they call them, like, sort of our monkey ape brains that are always trying to go to war, but if you have psychedelics, you're going to have such an open consciousness and just like love for everyone, and everything's going to be great. So and I was going to say, like, a subset of the psychedelic hype is related to religion. And so part of what's being pushed is that, we want to merge religions with psychedelic use as a way to revive those religions, and as a way to, like, bridge sort of the divisions between religions. And so you've got a very one of the most publicized studies from Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic Research is a clergy study where they found volunteers from different religious backgrounds who were clergy, so mostly rabbis and pastors and priests, and I think one imam, and they volunteered to undergo some psychedelic experiences at Johns Hopkins, and then they followed up with them to see, how did this affect their religious calling, their ministry, etc. And this was hyped up as like being kind of a huge thing. And then some whistleblowers came out, including my friend Joe Welker, who was involved tangentially with the study, to say like, there's some funny business going on. The funding, like some people involved in sort of interviewing the people are the same people funding the study. And there's a number of things that went on, which Johns Hopkins Review Board itself said are like serious irregularities. And so it kind of cast a shadow over the results that were coming out of this. And what it kind of did is it kind of brought into the open the fact that you have to take with a grain of salt a little bit the claims that are made, even from the scientific medical community, about psychedelics. It's not black and white. There's a lot of things going on behind the scenes in terms of funding and agendas, and so it's a complex picture.
Yeah, and I don't want to put my tinfoil hat on, but I maybe more recently see like people have, motives that often don't align with scripture, with the Bible, with God, to push, let's say, psychedelics in this instance as a solution for mental illness. And I think that's really where, all these people who just need to know God and have that hole in their life where they haven't met Jesus, they're going to try and replace that with yet another thing that's going to lead to emptiness. And a lot of people that, went to Burning Man had that sort of, revelation if they eventually come to Christ. So I think that's definitely like, the wrong sort of like, hey, at its root, it's wrong. And then I do think, while I might be more supportive of the technological side of like, okay, what about like in small doses for people who understand that this is not a solution for mental illness, or people who are actually struggling with depression because of chemical imbalances in the brain rather than, a secondary cause, that's where I would say like, yeah, I can support it, but it's often that these motives kind of convolute the research.
What would be your advice, Phil, if I'm a pastor in a church, which I mean I am now, and I have someone who is maybe using something for medicinal purposes, and they have a legitimate reason to use it for medicinal purposes, and I have someone else using the exact same thing but using it in ways that are considered sinful. How would you navigate a situation like that? What would you think the pastor should do there?
Wow, that's a great question, and that's a challenging situation to address. I think you have to take both cases separately, because even though the substance is the same, I think we all understand that even if you're not talking about psychedelics, you're talking about some sort of strong painkiller. Someone just post-surgery on a strong dose of morphine is very different than someone who is using those kinds of drugs in a way that's they're numbing themselves. There's an addiction going on. It's yeah. So I would think that the distinction there is one's motivation and how it's affecting one's life. And so within medicinal use, I think that's where, assuming that this is a legitimate medicinal usage, and I think that can be a complicated discussion as well. But
Right,
um,
for sure.
but yeah, I would basically lean in on that distinction of motivation, and also like the bigger, broader picture of that person's life. What role is this playing in their life? Yeah.
Yeah, it's complicated, and one of the things it makes me think about is in the early 2000s, like 2007, 2008, I remember learning about transgenderism, because it wasn't really a thing, but I remember learning about it. And then there's some people that are clearly very passionate about it, but it seemed like an edge case. And then you'd hear some kind of stat like, 1 in 1,000 people are born with neutral sex characteristics or something, when really the stats are it's far more rare than that. But you'd hear something like that and you'd go, well, we need to consider this nuance when it comes to this issue. And I remember then in the 2010s kind of being on my back foot when I'd bring that up whenever I'd hear about it, because I'm like, oh, well, here's something that's true, so this is complicated, we need to have nuance. And then all of a sudden the whole culture is shifting toward letting kids choose their own gender. Everything's preferred pronoun, this and
Yes.
that and the other thing. And basically, I think some Christians and churches, because they wanted to take, in my own experience, kind of a nuanced position, we weren't as clear as we could have been on the wrongs of what was going on. And I would liken what happened in the 2000s with transgenderism to what's happening in the 2020s with transhumanism.
Yes.
That we're going to hit in the next, I don't know, in the next 2 to 10 years, an increasing amount of people doing the exact types of things that you're describing, Phil, or that Elon Musk is doing, or Joe Rogan, or whatever, these, whether it's microdoses or whether it's Ozempic or whether it's, pick your, even caffeine doses. I heard about a delayed caffeine pill that you take before you go to sleep so that you wake up feeling refreshed because the caffeine hits you.
That's just sad.
So there's
I've done a caffeine nap. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like
you take
drink
drinks
a
of
coffee, 20
have
minutes.
a nap. Yeah. So it's, and so this, go ahead.
Tangent.
Well, to your point though, I think this is where, I personally come down a little bit more harshly on the, yes, God created this is part of God's good creation, but there needs to be a stronger, like, blanket repudiation of these things, because you're exactly right, Andrew. As someone who is a very proud nuance bro, I love nuance and am well known for nuance, like taking nuance stances where I can. There is something about nuance that does favor permissiveness and licentiousness. Like, there is something about nuance that does make it easier for people who are looking for a way to justify something that is wrong to doing so. And I think with transgenderism, especially, like, yes, we do need to be nuanced insofar as we need to clearly claim biblical truth in all its multifaceted aspects. But what people do with that is usually very different than what they don't always land at the biblical conclusion there. And so I would love your thoughts, Phil, on how we have, I think, a nuanced and moderate and sober-minded discussion about this, while recognizing and learning from past hot button cultural topics that there are people that do, we can be useful idiots when it comes to our nuance. And are we letting that happen here?
Yeah, it's a really great point, Austin. I agree. And I think my evaluation of the broader psychedelic movement, the place it has in broader culture, and the direction it's all going in, I'm conflicted because intellectual honesty on my part says I can't just say it's a blanket prohibition on every and all application of these substances.
Right.
I don't think that that's biblical. But I'm very concerned that, like, it's gonna cash out as, like, people are gonna be seriously harmed at scale, and it's gonna be, and it's already happening. People have lost their minds. People do have psychotic breaks. People do think that they receive illuminated enlightenment, and they go and they blow up their families by divorcing their spouses and leaving their kids.
Yeah.
Psychedelics, there's two things about psychedelics we need to also always remember. They give feelings of profundity. Okay, so you experience everything as extremely profound. That's kind of the trope about people who are stoned, right? Like, whoa, dude, like a flower,
Right.
And everything's so profound. And the second is that it increases your suggestibility. Okay, so you're in a state where, like you guys laid out, the brain there's a neuroplasticity is what they call it, where new connections can be formed, and that's probably the mechanism that can give it potential really beneficial therapeutic use for when people have blockages, mental blockages, whether it's PTSD or addiction. There is, I think, potential for some kind of application here where those very real problems can be helped to be overcome through the neuroplasticity that psychedelics bring about. But the fact that they enhance someone's suggestibility means that you're very susceptible to messaging, whether it's from what you're hearing in your experience or the people that are guiding you through your experience. And usually those people are very committed to kind of a new age worldview. And so there's all kinds of things here that I think on the whole, the movement is going to be, it's going to lead to a lot of human suffering. So there's a book came out in 2022 by Louis Ungit. He's a Christian. It's called The Return of the Dragon, The Shocking Way Drugs and Religion Shape People and Societies. And he's basically taken on the psychedelic movement and saying that it's mostly demonic. He traces all kinds of through lines in the Bible and history to point out that, these pagan cultures that celebrated psychedelic use, they had kind of a habit of like human sacrifice. And there was this imagery of the serpent coming back. Now, he draws probably more lengths than I'm comfortable with. Like some of the evidence seems a little bit tangential to me. And he draws more of a black and white conclusion than I would. But I would think his book, by and large, is kind of the low resolution messaging that is needed. Like, hey, big red flag here. Okay. There's a lot of hype and hubris about psychedelics. And he's putting the red light on saying like there's a real problem with this spiritually and in other ways. And then I think beyond that, I would love to see resources come out that have more nuance, that deal with the cases where you do need to kind of get into the details and make distinctions between different substances, different kinds of usages. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Changing.
Yeah, very well said.
Yeah, very, very well said. Joe, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to tangentially, before you change topics, I was going to say it did remind me, for anyone who had seen the House of David series, of King Saul kind of like engaging in pharmakia with like drugs and the witchcraft and all that type of stuff to suppress the demonic attack that was on him. So it is really, there is an association in scripture that I believe, as you mentioned, is a very big part of like the broader movement, where even if there's like a sliver of people actually using it for noble intent, it can often be overcome and then turn into this like whole societal movement that like is bad for humanity.
It sounds like I need to watch this show. I keep hearing nothing but good things about it, but I haven't had a chance to watch it yet. I was gonna change tack a little bit though, just to have some like some hopeful positivity in this discussion, because it gets really bleak whenever we keep talking about stuff like this. But how do we highlight the goodness of Christian spirituality against the spirituality of psychedelics? I've been reading through Matthew Bingham's A Heart of Flame for God, and talking about spiritual formation and the means that which God communes with us and we participate in communion with God. But how do you practically communicate the beauty of that to someone who is up against a spiritual transcendent experience brought on by psychedelics? What would you say is a good tack for that?
Yeah, I love that question. I haven't had a chance to check out that book yet, but it's on my list. I think that the way I think of it now is like the psychedelic movement is part of a broader movement, which is basically ushering Western civilization away from modernity or beyond modernity. Modernity being, I would say, associated with philosophical materialism. So, and then, just think in broad strokes, modernity sort of, post-enlightenment sort of communicates a vision of the world which is disenchanted, it's all material. And now basically that's crumbling. The new atheist movement was kind of like the last gasp of triumphalism from that movement. And it's gone, it's evaporating. And so the psychedelic movement, along with a renewed interest in the occult and new age, I think are symptoms. And then, on a positive side, we see an openness to Christianity again that we haven't really seen, 15 years ago. We're seeing it now among younger generations. So all of that to me is sort of indication that we're entering sort of a new era in terms of the prevailing worldview. And so then I think about the church. So how has the church navigated these different things? And I think I would say my reflections lead me to say that the modernity has affected the evangelical church more than we think. And I think our spirituality has probably taken the shape of being less enchanted, less mystical, than probably has been the norm throughout church history in different eras. And so, all that to say, I think we need to try and recover a sort of responsible and biblical Christian mysticism, because that is a legitimate part of what we see in the scriptures and church history. I mean, just read carefully through 2 Corinthians 12, 1-10, where Paul talks about this experience of being caught up to the third heaven. In the body or out of the body, I do not know, he says. And, you just sort of put that side to side with some of the psychedelic experiences you read about, and it's like, it's reading like the same kind of thing. So there's a category for Christians for these kinds of extraordinary experiences of the transcendent. I think the caveat is nowhere do we see that we are meant to pursue them or try to make them happen ourselves.
Yes.
I think that's a very important difference. And, I would say that's the message that is needed to respond to the movement among some Christians to try and integrate psychedelics with Christianity and spirituality, because they believe that this can be a way to connect with God. And I would say, whoa, I don't think that is what the Bible teaches us to do. But that being said, I want to elevate the ordinary means of grace. I want to elevate, like, I think regular life can be enchanted, and so many things about normal life are actually quite mystical and beautiful if only we could see them. And also have a category that's open to like the extraordinary. And I find a lot of evangelical and maybe especially Reformed Christians will have an extraordinary experience or hear someone who had an extraordinary experience, and the immediate knee-jerk reaction is to sort of dismiss or downplay it.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. I think we've all seen that. And I'm increasingly convinced that is not only is that the wrong response, but like there's something, I don't know if sinful's the right word, but there's something like, I don't know, it's not right, because if that comes from God, I think the uncomfortability we have with it is more a manifestation of our modernist thinking than it is truly sort of biblical thinking.
Well,
so,
and especially,
anyways, those are some thoughts.
Well, and especially too, I mean, in reading this book, it's really, really shown to me that I could do a good job at taking down maybe unbiblical approaches to Christian spirituality and ways of trying to commune with God or look for a spiritual experience, but I don't have a positive vision to replace that with. I don't actually have an alternative to give someone of like, this is what a biblical Christian spirituality looks like. This is what that should feel like. This is how that plays out as. And that's going to be a real key tool in the pastor's tool belt if they're dealing with someone who's dealing with a spiritual experience of psychedelics. If all they have is a mastery in all the ways to not do Christian spirituality, and they don't have a positive vision for what that looks like, why would that person choose anything different?
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is Reformed people should make some Pentecostal friends, and then we could have some more spiritual experiences along the way.
But there's more, and this is where my Reformed background is really just, I'm thankful for it, but it has its weaknesses. Like, there is more to Christian spirituality than just what Pentecostalism tries to display. Like, they don't have the quarter on that market, but those of us in this camp, those of us in the Reformed camp, we don't champion a positive vision for people to move towards. We only try to encourage people out of Pentecostalism and into big dusty old textbooks. That's our main card that we play.
There's something very real about that critique, and I think we have a lot of work to do to develop that and come up with a positive biblical vision that is compelling. Yeah.
Well, I gotta respect your time. I feel like we could keep talking, especially on this topic itself for longer. But I'll just say in closing that everybody ultimately will model their life after people they look up to, whether it's Andrew Tate's technologically adapted body, because he's going to adapt his body with the technology of weights to look a certain way, or Elon Musk's technological body that he adapts with microchips in brains or whatever, or Zuckerberg's technological body that is uploaded to the cloud and is in the metaverse. So I think there's a vision of what humanity could be right now and who we could model ourselves after. That is this utopic vision of a technologicalized man. But for Christians, we do not follow the technologicalized man. We follow the God man, who is truly human. And so we do not imitate the things of this world and their techniques. We imitate the God man, Jesus Christ, who lived present with people on earth. And no, we don't need to go back to his technology of his day, but we model the kinds of character traits that he had. And we live out this kind of compassion, this seeing other people, this willingness to speak on difficult issues, this willingness to care for the people who interrupt you. All the things that Jesus embodies that we need to think about and reflect. And that's what we're going to keep doing on this podcast. What would Jesus tech? We need to think about that as opposed to technologicalized man. So yeah, that's my like takeaway, my little thing. I was thinking about that for like the past 10 minutes. I was like, oh man, this is going to crystallize all together about what we're all about. Thank you for listening. Phil, you can be followed, not on social media that much, but a little bit you post there, but people can go to your website, philcotnoir.com. Anything else you want to shout out while you're here?
I mean, that's great. I've been a lot less active on social media, and that's just the way life works with different seasons of busyness. But I do try and post on my blog once in a while. But also at TGC Canada, you'll see some stuff there now and then.
Cool. So yeah, like I said, thank you, Phil, for joining. Thank you, listeners, for following along. We do have a Patreon page, and you can also support the show by sharing this episode with friends. This is kind of like, we're not a planned mini-series, but to do an episode all on demons and AI and then to go into psychedelics, it kind of pairs nicely together. So we'll see if the next episode is going to stay in this mindset. Who knows? But stay tuned. You can subscribe for more, like all that stuff. Take care. Bye now.
Yeah.